Hello and welcome to In Conversation. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, it's a wonderful thing in life that often comedy can be universal, creating laughter, whether it's Nairobi or Nigeria. Now, my guest this week is a man who's contributed to that with his creation Blackadder and his films Love Actually, Notting Hill and Four Weddings and a Funeral. His name is Richard Curtis, writer, director and also an advocate for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Richard, just get straight into it. How you found yourself in this work. It all started, I understand, when your mother showed you some footage on television which changed your life. How old were you and what happened?
Wow, that's very good research there, Chris. No, I mean, I often just wonder about these things. And it was 1968. There was a famine in Biafra. And it was Christmas, and my mum decided to cancel Christmas. She said we should take all the money that we would normally spend on presents and food and give it to help other people. And I think, one, I enjoyed the Christmas because it meant I could watch more TV instead of having a long, ghastly meal of turkey and sprouts. But also it just, I think, gave me a sense of, the simultaneity of other people's suffering, the fact that while you're having a good time, other people's lives can be very tough. And I think that's something that, I've never quite lost.
And you grew up and in latter years, 1985 to be precise, you took part in the famous worldwide concert for Ethiopia, Live Aid.
Well, I didn't really take part in it, but it was the key sort of event of my life, because after it, I then decided that if pop musicians could do a lot in order to help other people, then comedians should be able to do something. So as a result of that, I visited Ethiopia and I came back and we started, this thing called Comic Relief, which has an event called Red Nose Day. And I think since then we've raised 1.3 billion pounds, and that's taken quite a lot of time and work.
And to this day, you're still doing these sort of things. You're making a film, I understand, for the United Nations along that line. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, it's a film. I mean, it's a 30-minute film. It's called Nations United. You see what we've done there. And what it's just trying to do is talk a bit in as attractive a way. And I would recommend everyone to watch it on YouTube. It's talking as attractive a way about these global goals. And with the help of people like Burna Boy and Beyonce and Forrest Whitaker and Tandy Newton, what we're trying to do is lay out the areas in which the global goals have solutions. Often people think these are hard times, there are so many problems, there's nothing that can be done. And it couldn't be less true. And so what we're trying to do is show the intensity of the problems with climate and gender and injustice, but also fill people with a sense of the fact that they can do something about it and there are things to be done. And I've tried to bring my filmmaking skills of exciting music and really exciting cast and everything to illustrate it.
How different is it to making like a sort of box office Hollywood film?
Well, the weird thing is it's not as different as you'd think in that, you've got my friend Danny Boyle once said, there's only two things that matter in a film, the beginning and the end, and the beginning not so much. So, you focus on the beginning, you try and get good people in it, you try never to lose pace. You try to come to a storming conclusion. In this case, it's a song by Beyonce. So I found my as it were, Mr. Bean, Love Actually skills quite useful. And I hope that anyone who watches it won't switch off.
Now, for your philanthropic work, some years ago, you were awarded the CBE, the Commander of the British Empire. As you've probably seen in the papers the last few days, I mean, the poet Benjamin Zephaniah, he turned down a similar award because of the mention of the word empire. There's a talk about removing it completely from the awards and from our vocabulary. What do you think about that?
It's such an interesting issue, isn't it? I mean, I'm very in favor. I've been a very moderate person. I'm supporting the United Nations. I've set up a very friendly charity, but I always think that really sort of tough, argumentative, extreme voices are very useful. So I'm sometimes nervous of culture wars because I think people can fix on symbolic things instead of solving the problems. I'd rather not argue about the CBE and really try to do something about racial injustice in our countries. But if other people think that's a good thing, I'm happy to drop the E in the CBE.
But that's another case in point. I mean, it's 2020, and we're discussing whether or not the E should be removed from the OBE. Surely, as you say, there are so many more important issues that perhaps aren't being discussed. How do you feel about that as someone who is working hard as a philanthropist?
Well, the point about this film I've just made is that, theory is not enough. We actually need real changes. We need to get rid of tax dodging and tax avoidance in order to pay for health and education. We have to really push for quotas on gender representation so women can start making our decisions. We've got to get to net zero. So I think it's really important to change the climate of opinion by arguments about things like celebrating the British Empire. But I also think it's really important to nail the things you want to happen and campaign for those specific things that are going to, redistribute wealth and get us equality and fight injustice. So I love the theoretical arguments to create the right temperature, but then we've got to focus on the real change.
Now, one of the things that strikes me about your work is, as I said in the intro, this idea of universal laughs. I mean, I've had people quote sort of Blackadder and Love Actually to me all over this continent, and I've worked in a score of countries. I think that's great, but surely this idea of getting universal laughs and laughs in general, in the world where it's changing, there's more so-called political correctness. How difficult is it to write now and create humor where things are very sensitive?
Well, that is so, I've done Mr. Bean, he doesn't say anything. So that's lucky as well. What I'd say is humor always finds a way. When I was a young man, we very much came up in a time in the UK where we were called alternative comedians. So you didn't crack jokes about people's mother-in-law and people's weight, and certainly, racism, any kind of racist joke was completely out. So what I would say is, I think it's not getting more difficult. You just have to think of different things to be, different things to be funny about. I don't notice that in our own lives, people are getting less funny. And the thing is, with comedy, you shouldn't really think about other people. You should think what makes you laugh. And if you stop laughing at anything that actually is racially insensitive or something like that, you wouldn't crack those jokes anyway.
I mean, just as an example, and I'm showing my age now, I mean, I was a viewer of Not the 9 O'Clock News, which you were involved in the UK. Yeah. And I remember a particular sketch involving Rowan Atkinson where guys had allegedly killed his wife as part of Game for a Laugh. It was a skit on the Game for a Laugh. Now, that kind of thing now, if you put it on TV, it would be a week's worth of stories in the newspapers afterwards.
And you wouldn't do it. I think that's the truth of it, and I look at my films, which are, have not got as much, diverse casting as I wish they now did retrospectively. I wouldn't do it. So that is the point. I think this film I've just made, Nations United, I can see a scenario 5 years ago where it would have been, 6 middle-aged white men explaining to everyone in the world what ought to be done. Instead of which, we have an extraordinary cast. Michelle Yeoh, we're listening to Malala, we're listening to Greta Thunberg. So I think that the point is, change happens because nobody wants to do things the old way. And so when I look back, there will be things in my career that aren't right. And when I look forward, I bet that there's changes still to come.
Okay, and I must say also, I mean, I read a very scathing article on your work once. I think it was in The Guardian, I don't know.
I
I'm sure
bet,
you
I
could,
bet.
I bet, yeah, no, I bet they were saying that their criticism of your films like Love Actually, perhaps not Love Actually so much, but Four Weddings and a Funeral certainly, was that it was this very kind of smug, middle-class view of the UK and ignoring some of the real issues that were coming up at the time. How do you feel about that?
Well, look, obviously, I agree with anyone who doesn't like my work, but I mean, one of the things I'd say about Four Weddings is it was one of the first times that a gay romantic relationship was portrayed with total relaxation. I remember Simon Callow saying it was the first time he'd ever read a film script in which the gay man didn't die of AIDS, died of a heart attack. So, there were different times and we were trying to do different things. And I think that movies reflect the society we live in. And what I'm trying to do with my work with the UN is change the texture of the societies that we live in. So that actually when someone, like me in 5 years' time makes a film like Four Weddings, then they would be dealing with the subjects that are existing in society and everything would have moved on.
If you came across a script like Four Weddings and a Funeral now, would you go ahead and make it here in 2020?
We certainly wouldn't make it without, a more diverse cast. I think that is very true. And, I do think that we have to listen to other voices. I think, you're broadcasting from Africa. Did we in 1985 listen to the voices from theirs explaining their problems rather than telling them what we thought the problems were? So, I just think that we have to open up the dialogue in every country to the people who've got lived experience. And I was in Four Weddings, writing about my lived experience. I mean, very definitely. But if I was offered the choice between making a film, producing a film about some posh people and what it's like to live, in tough circumstances in Birmingham, I'd back the Birmingham film at the moment and just see whether or not you can make it so well that a lot of people want to see it.
But another point you mentioned there about diversity, certainly. I mean, actually, one of the Love Actually, you had Chiwetel Ejiofor of Nigeria in your piece there. But a lot of the actors here in Africa, and I've spoken to a lot of them down the years on this channel, a lot of them still complain they feel like when they go into these films, they're just there to sort of make up the numbers. There's almost like sort of tokenism. What's your view on that?
Well, I bet that was a bit true. And I'm sure it still is. But things are changing. The more that you see and experience and give opportunities to great actors, the more that they get, cast in bigger parts for their own worth. So the film I just made called Yesterday, which was my movie with Danny Boyle about the Beatles, the lead star was a guy called Himesh Patel. We had much more famous white actors, but Himesh, who I'd seen acting before, was the best for the part. And what I hope is that we will become colorblind after having an intense period of really trying to cast people, even if they feel a bit, it's because of my color. Then they'll play the roles, they'll play them brilliantly, and then there'll be a level playing field in which everyone will get the roles that they desire. And I think that, this push for equality is the big thing in the world. It's particularly on the issue of gender. The idea that half the world doesn't have the same rights, the same privileges, the same property rights, the same banking, the same education, that's ridiculous. And when we actually do get women in equal positions, they will really exercise that power brilliantly, and the world will be the stronger for it.
Actually, speaking about your work, one thing, there's an urban myth that I heard once about Notting Hill, and I want to ask you now. Somebody once told me that actually what happened to Hugh Grant in the film was actually happened to a real life friend of yours. Is that true or not?
Oh, it's not true. It was based on a fantasy. As I used to go and drive to my friend's house, having no new stories to tell, I remember thinking, wouldn't it be great if I turned up with, Madonna or Princess Di in the car? How would they react? So a lot of films are a kind of enactment of a dream that's not going to come true, and that was the case with Notting Hill. Madonna did nearly once come around to my house, and I tidied the house and put lots of Madonna albums out on the coffee room table, but she didn't turn up.
And it didn't work out. But the only thing I thought about
Celebs
not,
don't show. That's my motto.
but I mean, the only thing I thought about Notting Hill was that Hugh Grant, supports my football team, Fulham, and
Fulham.
he's suffered enough. So I don't see why you had to put him through even more. Anyway, but the other person that I see you quoting quite a lot in your articles is Nelson Mandela. You used the famous one, "Everything seems impossible until it's done." Did you, what's your experience with the man, and did you actually meet him at some stage?
I did meet him, but in just a hello. I don't think he would remember meeting me. I remember coming when I was in South Africa once to an incredibly impressive event where someone who'd been censoring his letters while he was in Robben Island found those letters in a box and was giving them, I think, to the Mandela Museum there. And it's funny you say that, but I remember him that occasion for his humor. I remember one of his other colleagues stepping up to make a speech and Mandela muttering into a microphone, "Don't listen to a word this man says, he's a dangerous communist." And I remember thinking, oh, that is so interesting, that one of the things that made this man great was that he wasn't po-faced, that he was able to hang on to his sense of humor. And it is, humor is a thing that breaks down barriers. And one of the things that I'm, fighting for all the time is to let us talk to each other as humans and see things from other people's perspective. He was a political, genius at that.
But there's a case in point. I mean, I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Mandela when I was a reporter on the road here in Africa. And one of his favorite jokes, and I can tell you, and the man himself confirmed it, that was aimed at as a fellow called Arthur Chaskelson, who was one of his lawyers in the Rivonia trial that saw him go to prison for life for sabotage. And apparently Mandela used to introduce him to people and say, "Oh, this is my lawyer. He managed to secure me 27 years in prison." Now, the point is that kind of a joke in this day and age would it pass politically correct muster? Are you not mocking important, sincerely held beliefs? Are you not mocking people?
I think you're allowed to do it. I think you're allowed to do it if you're the victim. Do you know what? If you're the person it's happened to, it's always been said that the people who are allowed to be a bit dismissive of let's say you if you're Jewish are only the people who are themselves Jewish. So I think that I think as long as you're self-mocking, that's okay. And I do think these are really tough times, and I think that high spirits and optimism are still crucial. That's what this film is about. It's about solutions. And I think that if we allowed ourselves to be weighed down and not to think that there's a way out, that we're allowed to use friendship, partnership, humor to make friends and get things done, I don't see cynics achieving many things. So let's try and live with humor, friendship, warmth, and partnership, rather than just saying, well, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, because I think it's positive action that's going to change the world and create more of a window for laughter in the years ahead.
But you mentioned there, the problems that the world's been through in the last year with COVID-19, everything from sustainable development goals for the UN to the making of films that everyone can get along with. I mean, everything's been knocked sideways by this. I mean, surely you must have had some fairly dark days in the last 8 or 9 months since COVID-19 happened.
I do think, I think everyone, we're living through a global tragedy. You take hope. A man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest. You take hope from the thought that it's often taken a big event to create big new things. So the UN itself came after the Second World War. And in the UK, we got our extraordinary NHS directly after the Second World War. It's quite interesting the way that a crisis creates the energy for new things. So I think that what we have to hope is that the pandemic makes people accelerate the things that they were doing. So on climate, which is one of the big issues, in our film, it really does. The pandemic has proved big, bad things can happen. New York can get taken over by a disease. It could be flooded, by water. And so I'm hoping that what will happen now is that every company will say, well, what am I doing to achieve net zero? What am I doing for the environment? I can't say that's a bit of any other business any longer. That's got to be one of my key concerns. So I'm hoping that, in the same way as I'm on your show now talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm hoping that everyone will say after this pandemic, we've got to see that the behavior of individuals and the behavior of companies actually is really important to the global community. And now is the time for radical action rather than just waiting another 5 years till another bad thing happens.
How much do you fear, though, which I'm sorry to say I fear, that panic and that zest for survival is going to take hold in the world corporate setup, and companies are going to start perhaps doing things they shouldn't do just to try to survive?
Well, look, that is one of the things that can happen. I think that, there are other big forces, certainly in the UK. We've got a real consumer revolution going on here. People are really thinking, about the clothes they wear, the food they eat, the way they travel, the cars they buy, the pensions they take out. So I've got a feeling there may be more panic from corporate people saying, if I don't change, mine turns into a risky business. Actually, the least risky thing to do is to start considering diversity, equality, the environment. So I'm hoping the panic is going to be more about I'm not doing the right thing, and the customer and my employees are going to demand I do the right thing. So I'm hoping the panic will be in the direction of good change rather than I must commit more crimes, because one of the huge risks to companies now are scandals. You saw what happened to Volkswagen. You see what's just happens. It happens all the time now that companies get caught out, like HSBC in the last few days, doing what they shouldn't do. Their share price drops. So I think companies will start doing what they should do, even if sometimes they do it, as it were, to self-protect rather than to protect the planet and the people on it.
But how depressed do you get sometime? And you developed your career in the 1980s. There was that era of sort of acquisitiveness and boom and all the rest of it. But there's kind of a more sinister, for want of a better word, avarice that's going on now in world business. How depressed do you get about it sometimes?
As you can see from my films, Chris, I tend to look at the, optimistic side of it. And as an SDG advocate, I've heard the Secretary General say that the biggest surprise in the last 5 years has been the way that business has actually gone ahead of politics. So I think that on these goals. So I'm sure there are bad things happening, and I really admire the journalists who ferret them out and expose them. But I really think it's really important to celebrate the great things that companies are doing as well. The people who are really moving, who are committing to net zero, even if they don't know how they're going to get there. The people who are changing. You see Unilever changing every single product to make it more environmentally safe. So I think it's always this, life's a pile of good things and a pile of bad things. But I'm for celebrating the examples of things that are going well and setting an example, and let the scoundrels, fester and become fewer.
And Just lastly, very briefly, afraid we run out of time, but in the world of business and economics, is what CNBC Africa is about, what does give you hope here at the end of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020?
I think the thing that gives me hope is the movement of investment towards ethical investment. I believe there's some figure like, 17 billion has moved into ESG and 22 million has moved the other way. I think people are starting to see that if they don't invest in the businesses of the future, their businesses won't work, that if we get global warming of 3.5%, insurance ceases to exist as a business. So I'm really hoping that those people with new ideas who are behaving according to the rules, fighting for climate, fighting for diversity, gender equality, that the money is going to move into them and it's going to make money. That you don't, when you invest, it's not, as it were, value versus values, morals versus money. I think that there's a real possibility that it may be the business sector, supplying itself with money to support the best projects that moves things along fastest. That's the thing that I'm hoping for in business. And, great people like Mark Carney are really arguing for this. And you start seeing pension funds and investors moving in the direction of ethical and increasingly profitable investment.
Well, on that hopeful note, thank you very much indeed. That was Richard Curtis, writer, film director, the man behind Blackadder and Mr. Bean, and also UN Sustainable Goals advocate. Thank you very much indeed for your time and insights, and I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of In Conversation. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.